Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Ready for Real Life webinar. Tonight, we're going through the Ready to Lead Culture episode, How to Take Dominion of the Arts Without the Arts Taking Dominion of You. And we'll be speaking tonight about music, art, photography, graphic design, fashion, and filmmaking, if we can make through it all in the time that we have. We've been getting some wonderful questions from you all, and we thought we had better begin the night by answering some of them for you. And so let's do that as we begin. The first question we'll dig into is this: my greatest struggle and question is to know how much schoolwork to do with my children versus how much real life and training them in the skills that they will need for life. And so as we go over these questions that you send, and we want to invite you tonight to continue to type them in. We may not be able to get to many of your questions this evening, but we'll do the ones we can. And then in episode 7 of this webinar, we'll get into as many as we possibly can in answering those. We take this very seriously in how we formulate answers for you and where we get our answers. And as we begin the evening tonight, let's stop and go to the source of your wisdom and our wisdom. Join me in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we do thank you that you have promised that if we come to you and we ask believing, you do give wisdom. And we do confess to you that we are a people living in such a dark and crooked and confused and perverted and twisted generation that we need a lot of wisdom. We have taken on board and taken into our heart things that we never should have. And we realize that in teaching our children. We have to correct ourselves before we can build in them a good foundation. So we pray for wisdom in how we will do this together. And so we commit this evening to you. We look to you as our leader in the name of Jesus Christ and for his kingdom and in his authority. We gather together tonight and we ask you to help us. Amen. And so with this very important question, we know many of you are struggling with it. When we tried to start building our own home as young Christians, Victoria and I didn't know exactly how to build the school part of things. And of course, our default position was to have some school time and have some school books, and the real world was something totally different. But we learned quickly that we cannot make a distinction in that. And so I would say if academic work that you have that has come into your home and some expert or some catalog is sent to you, if that academic work doesn't give your children a skill that they need for the real world, you don't need that as part of their education. Get it out of your house and get it out of their lives. The paradigm that we came to realize was the biblical paradigm is that all of life is training for the real world. All of life is, and our children need to see that, and we need to see that from the very first moments they wake up to the very last moments before they fall asleep at night. All of life is training, and we are there. We're given to our children to be their trainers and their coaches, their mentors, their guidance counselors, those who take them and test them and stretch them and give them assignments and give them challenges. And so when we present to our children something that they need for that, hey, you need to do some push-ups for strength in your upper body. You need to study and read English. You need to learn the alphabet so that you know the code for learning English. And you need English because what an important first language it is for you to learn, because you'll probably be learning lots of languages. And as soon as your children see that there's a foundational need and reason why we're doing these things, we're getting them ready for the real world from the very beginning. Way before formal schooling starts, we're training them in the work that they need to do. And so everything you do with your children can be educational, must be, and is educational as long as you're talking with them. And if you're not very verbal naturally communicative, you simply need to work on it, especially you dads. We are not verbal enough. We're not communicative enough. We need to work extra hard on that. Victoria.
Well, I discovered as we went through the years that often real life offered learning opportunities that were unique, and often they were more important than the whatever educational activities I had planned for that day. And when those come along, you should take advantage of them. For instance, one day we we found a badly injured lamb that had fallen off of a truck. And we just took the day off from schoolwork to butcher that lamb. Life often brings opportunities to learn things which we hadn't planned on or foreseen. And moms, you need to be flexible enough to take advantage of opportunities like these, like the day when you find a baby bird, or the day when you get a package that's shipped with dry ice in it. Well, you should take advantage of those opportunities to read and learn about it, and take advantage of your children's questions. This is the teachable moment. And really, anything you do with your children can be educational as long as you're talking to them about it. And as Jeff said, if you're just not naturally very verbal or very communicative, you'll just need to remember to work on that.
Okay, next question. How do you fit in teaching one-on-one? Okay, well, if you have a lot of children and you have a lot of little children, that is a challenge. But the point about biblical education that we discussed in the very first episode is from Deuteronomy 6. You need to walk alongside your children. You need to walk with them and talk with them every day. The things that you involve them in what you're doing. You mothers when you're cooking, you dads when you're doing things around the house, have your children with you, speak to them, and take the extra time. If you need to teach them to do a task and do a chore and do a job, and you can't say to yourself, well, it's just going to be quicker if I do it. Of course it'll be quicker if you do it. But how will they learn about real life unless you stop and teach them how to fix something that's broken or to do a complicated job that's beyond their means? How about stretching them to do it? So walking along with them, talking with them. And Victoria, talk a little bit about what we did with the children in enlisting the older to actually walk alongside the younger.
Well, that was a really important part of one-on-one time. If I didn't have enough time to answer the younger ones' questions, I would have older ones, for instance, who were good in math, help them with a problem they were having trouble with. Another thing I did, I think that as much as you can, it's good to group your children together. And I was often surprised to see that the younger ones could keep up with the older ones a lot better than I thought. But if a single child needed my attention, say with a math problem he was having trouble with, well, I might do that at nap time, or maybe when others were doing things on their own, or maybe I wouldn't have time to do that till after supper. And what this means is that so-called school time began to be spread out and incorporated into the whole day, because we found as we got deeper into homeschooling that we just couldn't fit everything we were doing academically into one part of the day and check it off the list. And, that's all to the good, because the model we see in Deuteronomy 6 is that education is incorporated into all of life and not the other way around. Life doesn't revolve around schoolwork. Schoolwork or education fits into life. So we shouldn't think of schoolwork as something to hurry up and finish so that we can check it off and get on with our real lives. Education really should be an integral and ongoing part of our real lives.
Next question is, what did play look like in your home? My children play a lot, asks the questioner, and school very little. They play with action figures and dolls. I'm worried we let them play too much and that there could be something else I could do to direct their attention. And so tonight I have with us Benjamin and Anna and Anna Sophia and Elizabeth. And Isaac is going to be calling in. He's traveling between airports, and if he can get to a signal, he'll be calling in and joining us as we talk about culture tonight. But Anna, what do you remember about your playtime in our home?
Yeah, well, we certainly did have playtime, but the main thing that I remember is that it was always constructive. And I even think that our parents actually did a lot to guide our future interests and future activities by the toys that they got for us and the things that they left around the house for us to play with. And so often playtime looked like drawing, creating things with clay, building forts in the woods, building with Legos, Fisher Technics, Tinker Toys, sewing clothes for dolls, playing house, putting on puppet shows, making little movies. I think we even did a little radio dramas, comic strips. And all of these things were educational. I'd say they were a very important part of our education, but they were, of course, also fun. And they gave us practice collaborating with each other. And in many ways, I think that this kind of play carried over into our adult lives almost as much as our school did. And I think that parents can be very involved in helping their children with the toys that they get for them.
Okay, well, let's dive into the topic of the evening tonight. What is culture? This is one of the more important sessions that we're doing with you. One very good definition of culture that I use with people, with parents who talk to me about it. It's the secondary environment which has been superimposed on nature by man's creative effort. It's been superimposed on the world, on our environment by man's creative effort. We're built in the image of God. We're supposed to be creative, and the things that we do will be the culture. Another definition, this one by Henry Van Til, it's the activity of man, the image bearer of God, by which he fulfills the creation mandate to cultivate the earth, to have dominion over it, and to subdue it. This is a really good definition. And so if you're made in the image of God, you have that creative urge, that urge to work, that urge to build, that urge to change things. Well, we're supposed to take all that energy that the Lord has given us. We're made in the image of God, the great creator with a capital C. And we are to create and cultivate the earth, to have dominion over it. And that's not a cruel kind of dominion. It's to bring order to it, the way the Lord designed it, and to subdue it. And so man's essential being is expressive of his relationship to God, or it will be expressive of his relationship to rival gods, like Satan. And this is what Adam and Eve struggled with in the garden. And so how do we teach culture at home? Is there a curriculum? Parents ask, how do we turn our little children into cultured individuals? And let me just say that I don't know of any single curriculum out there that does this at all. And so what we've done in our family is just to get to the essence of culture. We need to teach our children what is the purpose of man. And it's best contained in the very last command that Jesus Christ gave. Go ye therefore and teach all nations to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And so if we're doing this, if you just look at this easy command, it's a very simple command. We go and we teach all nations. This is how we subdue the earth, how we put it into order, by teaching them, all nations, individuals, nations, all the institutions and all the nations, to observe everything that Christ commanded. That's what brings order to the world. That's what brings honor to Christ. That's what brings glory to the realm of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. I think this verse in Isaiah 9:7 summarizes the essence of culture and what we need to teach our children almost better than any other verse besides the Great Commission, Isaiah 9, verse 7. And it's about Jesus Christ, the Messiah. Of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end. This is the will of God for the world and for us. And so if we're doing our duty to obey Jesus Christ because we love him, and we're seeing the increase of his government, we're extending the reign of the King, then we are enculturating the world in the way that it needs to be enculturated. Your children need to know how to do this. How do we increase his government and peace so that there's no end of it, no interruption to it, no enemies who get in the way? Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it. To order it. See, there's that phrase that the Lord gives. His will for us is to bring order to the world that he's put us in. And even in this very disorderly generation that we're living in at the first part of the 21st century, we must continue. We must continue to do this and not be pessimistic about the 21st century, which is messed up. We've got to continue to build and teach our children how to bring order, even to the most disrupted, degenerate places and corners on the planet Earth. With, going on in the verse, judgment and with justice from henceforth, even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. And your children need to come to develop the kind of zeal for their Father's business and for the business of their Lord Jesus Christ, that this is the most important thing to them. Culture is a command in Scripture. cultivate the earth, subdue it, take dominion by putting everything in order. And we see this in Genesis 1:28, 2:15, 3:23. This is the dominion mandate. Now, here's a very interesting statement. A thoroughly cultured person is one who is thoroughly matured in every part of his life. And so if you really want your children to be cultured in the way that the West and Christendom has used this term in the past, he's got to be thoroughly matured. That means thoroughly responsible in every part of his life, so that he is able to fulfill the purpose of his creation. This is a wonderful statement. Man is a cultural creature. All culture is religiously oriented, and we need to train our children to know exactly how to dress the culture. God commanded Adam in the garden to dress the garden, to bring order to it. And we can either dress it according to what God wants it to look like, or we can follow along with the world, and we can develop a completely different look that actually disintegrates culture. Culture is what we do creatively to dress our environment with meaning. We can't dress it with a lack of meaning or with insanity, as many of our poets and balladeers and musicians and filmmakers are doing. Bozhidar Marinov has defined Christ's mission to actually preach culture. He said this is what the Great Commission is about, to preach culture. That's what we're preaching when we go do our duty. And his quote says, culture and what we're preaching is not as ballet and theater buildings, but culture as legal structure, interpersonal relationships, practical worldview, cosmology, institutional arrangements and ideology, philosophy of being, and psychology, and not pseudo-psychology, but really the study of the mind, business relations, legitimate spheres of government, view of time and future. In short, true culture is everything that pertains to the totality of man. And I would just add, it's everything that pertains to the real life that your children are entering in the 21st century. And so Isaac was hoping to have tied into us by phone. Is Isaac there yet, or is he still on his way? He's still on his way. I'll try to give you some of the points that he wanted to make, if I can, in getting our children ready for the culture wars. Well, you start young. You need to start very young. And we did this with Isaac, and he became, as he grew older, a very astute and careful and observant cultural analyst. He went to Egypt not long ago and did this series on navigating history Egypt, which is available at our website. And when he was there, he applied the things that he learned about the fact that the world is a battleground and not a playground, and culture is being formed by people who are either on God's side or working against his will. And Isaac always did understand that it's religion externalized. Culture would be, are you serving the Creator, or are you serving the creature and worshiping him? And what we can see, and what he saw in Egypt, was a fact that we have an irreligious people worshiping a false religion, and they're tearing the order of the world down by what they do. Isaac has made the point that what a person believes or wants to believe will shape what he values completely and how he sees the world. This is a painting Isaac selected for you to see, painted by Vermeer back during the time of the Great Reformation in the Low Countries. He believed that women should be painted like this, and the more modern Spaniard, Pablo Picasso, who was truly a degenerate man, an impure man, a man who cursed his father, ran away from home at a very young age to go live in a brothel, and completely deranged his mind according to the promises of Romans chapter 1, and this is how he begins to be viewing the world. Isaac points out that the culture that you are part of is totally pervasive. In America, we're totally surrounded by a culture that we hardly even recognize anymore. It's easier to see different cultures when we go traveling abroad. This is Cairo, downtown Cairo. When Isaac came to New Zealand with his family as a young man, he made many astute observations about a completely different culture, and we were experiencing some culture shock. Egypt's Islamic religion in Cairo has created and enforced a very specific external culture. Women are supposed to look like like this. They're supposed to be treated a certain way. They're supposed to expect certain things and never expect other things. And there's no cultural expectation that streets should be kept clean, for example. There's no, this is a picture of just a typical street in Cairo. Americans, Isaac says, tend to see culture as sort of a flavor of a place, rather than the entire religious direction of a country or a nation. People are basically the same all over the world. Isaac says we tend to see and say this when we study culture, and when the social studies books and textbooks try to paint this picture, they don't get the biblical picture right. They use words like diversity and multiculturalism. That just means that there's different flavors of food, different styles of clothes. But here's a quote that I really appreciate from my son, Isaac Botkin. Culture is not just the icing on the cake. Culture is the oven that bakes the cake. Culture isn't neutral, and your children's attitude toward it can never be neutral either. You must be training them to be capable of explaining the power to their children and to their grandchildren, and be able to see and explain what's going on in Syria this week, teaching them to see different cultural influences that are affecting them and the people around them. They will be affected by what goes on in Asia. The 21st century is the Asian century. They will be affected by what goes on in Egypt and with the Islamic world, because it's coming to the U.S., the powers and the influence of this religious culture. And so, Victoria, tell us what some of the things that you remember. Victoria worked so hard to teach and train Isaac and the other children to be aware of cultural influences in the battlefield that they lived on.
Well, it's clear that teaching our children about culture is a very, very important part of a parent's job. And I've thought of some practical steps, I think, to ways we can teach our children to be aware of cultural influences and what those influences are saying. And you can't start this too young. It all starts with talking to your children about what they are seeing and hearing. And one place this happens is at Walmart. If you see your 3-year-old daughter gravitating toward things that aren't good, like Bratz dolls, for instance, you need to understand this is a red flag. This isn't a neutral thing. This isn't a thing she will outgrow if you leave it alone. There's something in your child's heart that makes her like what the Bratz doll communicates, and you need to address this, and you need to work to redirect your child's heart. You do this in moral terms. You use verses to explain why this is bad. The attitude this doll has is bad. And then you use verses to teach what kind of attitude is good and pleasing to the Lord. In our house, from the time our children were little until the present day, there was a constant running commentary about everything. If we saw anyone gravitating toward the wrong aspects of culture, we knew that it was because of something in their hearts. And we're not just talking about guarding their cultural tastes. We have a duty as parents to direct their tastes too. Whatever things you want to become part of your children's lives later on, you should introduce those to them when they're young. This is the best time to do it. The time when they really want to be like mom and dad is the time when you can teach them to love what you love. We saw on YouTube a few days ago a video of a 3-year-old boy conducting part of a Beethoven symphony. His father is a conductor, and you should try to find that and watch it, and you can see that he is not too young to love classical music. Well, there are 3-year-olds out there who have learned to love football or opera or golf or ballet. Well, but that's not really what culture is. The important thing, the most important thing that we as parents need to model to our children is a love of God's Word and a real enthusiasm for it.
Benjamin, let me bring you up. But you know that what we did see with that 3-year-old boy was phenomenal. He had memorized the entire symphony, the entire Beethoven symphony. He could conduct it flawlessly. He knew what was coming, and it was an imaginary orchestra, but he could conduct it as he listened to it on the stereo. We had a 3-year-old boy visited our home recently with a family who was traveling through, and we noticed his parents had trained him to be such a conversationalist and such a good listener. He could listen to every single conversation and not miss a word and contribute at 3 years old at table conversations, and we were very thankful for the care that his parents had given him. Benjamin.
Okay, so we've talked some about what culture is, but what is the Christian's place in culture? There are a lot of Christians who are confused on this. Is culture, does it belong to Satan? Are we just supposed to take a back seat and sort of pray and wait for things to change? Basically, what's our involvement? What's our role? Well, we read 2 Corinthians 5 last week and mentioned that the identity of the Christian is an ambassadorial one, that we're here on earth to accurately represent his interests and agenda. So, since we're his representatives, the real question is, what is God's place in culture and what are his interests? Does he speak to culture? Does he care about aesthetics? And this is something we've obviously gotten into to some degree already, but I had a couple of verses that are just really great, just really nail this, and here they are. Colossians 1, verses 16 and 17. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And John 1, verses 1 through 3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And all things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. So if anything exists, music, art, science, mathematics, fashion, or anything, it came into existence through God and by him and for him. So it's impossible for something to exist and for God to not have an opinion on the matter and a purpose for its existence. So our job is to discover what his opinions are and make them known, to fill the earth with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So really, the Christian's place in culture is to be leading it on behalf of the God who owns it. So, next step is we need to discover what God likes or dislikes. And how do we do that? Especially when it comes to topics as tricky as culture and aesthetics. Well, God does give us instruction in the Scripture on how to learn that. And the primary way that we learn from God is from God directly through his Word. And we talked about this last week, 1 Timothy 3:16, that the Word is the grid through which we analyze and the lens through which we view all things, and through it we know how to be and are equipped for every good work. And then another way that we can learn about God, another way that God has commanded us to learn is to learn from men. For example, from our fathers and mothers, Proverbs 1, verse 8. From the wise, the aged, our authorities, the elder and the ancestor, Proverbs 13, verses 20, Deuteronomy 32, 7, and others. We also learn from history, which we will be discussing in greater length in a future episode of this webinar. But another way that's really significant that we learn about God is we learn from creation. And here are some examples in Scripture. We are told to go to the ant, to observe her ways and be wise, Proverbs 6, verse 6. To observe how the lilies of the field grow, Matthew 6, verse 28. And that teaches us about beauty. To stand and consider the wonders of God, Job 37:14. That the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands, Psalm 19, verse 1. And we're also told that when we consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, we discover that there is a lot about God intended for us to learn through the creation. So creation is not just neutral Gaia creatures and plants that exist. God has many uses for it, and one of it is to teach us important things about himself. And so a lot of what we know about aesthetics and beauty, mathematics and physics, and science and biology are things that we learn through observing creation, or, in other words, observational science. So when it comes to learning a topic, let's just pick music. The first step would be to search the Scripture for what it says on it. The Word instructs our thought and our hearts to wisdom and creates a lens of principle through which we can interpret details that are not explicitly spoken of in the Word. So Scripture governs and dictates the way we view all other teaching sources. Then you get advice from man, from your parents, elders, wise men, and knowledgeable craftsmen like Bach, Mozart, etc. And you humbly try to learn about creation through observational science. Discover the laws, patterns, boundaries, and beauty that God has built into the DNA of creation. So I guess to sum up, that would be a really basic grid through which we could start to approach and analyze aesthetics.
Yep. Thank you, Ben. You know, one of the great dramas that our children have really loved talking about is when we as parents, when Victoria and I were able to say, okay, here's a subject we're going to study, biology or astronomy or chemistry. What is the battleground in this science and in this discipline? What is the battleground in the queen of the sciences, theology? What is the battleground on political science? In every single one of these disciplines, there has always been a raging battle, which is called the antithesis. We've spoken about that. It's a battleground. There are people who will worship and serve the Creator and try to organize things and study things and proclaim things that are correct and true. And there will be others who say, no, we have a new theory on biology, the origin of man. We have a new theory on the way societies should be run. Our political science is scientific secular statism, for example. It's a new authoritarian organizational method that we've come up with, and we think it's better. And so one of the greatest battles of the 20th century was in this sphere of political science and government and governance. And Christians truly lost this culture battle in America in the 20th century. For 300 years, we'd been working to settle that question. How should a nation be built? And we were trying to write the book on nation building. What are the Christian foundations that have really never been fully and properly and theologically set up in a nation? And our forefathers were trying to do that. But in the 20th century, the 4th century of the history of our country, we lost that battle and we surrendered. And your children need to understand this logical progression of how our enemies worked. And this is a statement by Wilhelm Reich, who was one of the Frankfurt School faculty members who wrote this strategy. And he said, very, very clearly, if there's no God, there can be no religion. So his point was trying to erase all the knowledge of God from culture, to eliminate Christianity from all over the West, not just in the U.S., but all over Europe, any place that Western Christendom had triumphed. His ambition with his revolutionary friends and cohorts was to get rid of Christianity. He said, we've got the formula, this is it. If there's no God, there can be no religion. If there's no religion, there can be no morals. If there are no morals, there can be no self-control. If there's no self-control, there can be no social order. If there's no social order, there can be nothing but the chaos of competing desires. But we can't have chaos in a society, so therefore we must institute behavioral control. What he wanted was mass psychology in place of all the traditional structures of the past. No family, no church anymore, no free market, no limited local government. We will have institutional control from the tyrant. And that's how we will ultimately get rid of God and Christianity. And here's another quote. Now, you see the progression of that. It's such a simple formula. If you can eliminate the knowledge of God, then you have a perfect opportunity for tyrants, a totally centralized regulatory government to rule. We as communists, said Reich, used to debate people about the existence of God, and after a while I came to a conclusion, and he wrote this in 1933. He said, after a while I came to a conclusion that this was a waste of time. You're not going to debate people away from the existence of God. But what we found was that if you get people involved in deviant sexual behavior, the whole idea of God just disappears automatically. So they worked very hard, these Frankfurt School revolutionaries, masquerading as academics, to insert what they called, just a complete social revolution to overthrow Christianity with decadence and cultural disintegration. Marcuse, the disciple of Wilhelm Reich, said, we would not bring down Western culture with philosophical writings about 12-tone music. You're not going to bring it down. No, he says, you are going to bring it down through sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And he wrote about this extensively. He's a hero on most university campuses. You can buy the books of Wilhelm Reich, Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, and their other colleagues who articulated this theology on how you destroy Christianity and get rid of Western civilization. Marcuse wrote that what we need in America is a polymorphous perversity, creating a society caught in endless adolescence. That's what your children have been born into. And this polymorphous perversity means you just do what you want when you want to. You justify it any way you want, any kind of misbehavior, but especially sexual misbehavior, you justify and rationalize according to the tools that this modern culture is giving to young people. And so, very quickly, I want to, as we move into our discussion of music here, real quickly, let me just say, I'll go as fast as I can, that for 300 years, Americans wrote music about nation building, bringing order to a culture, building culture the way it should be built, honoring the Lord's design, his architecture for it. The very first music sung in this country were psalms. It's part of the Bay Psalm book. I was just informed this evening, one of the surviving copies is on auction very soon and is expected to go from between 15 and 25 million, I think. And so for the next 150 years, the colonists were known as psalm singers. And the word was used by a pejorative by the British, who were not as grounded in biblical cultural Christianity. But we fought a war over the freedom that we wanted to have so that we could continue building the foundations around proper biblical culture. And we sang about it. We built music around it. We had lyrics around the Christian foundations of culture, both black and white. For 400 years, Americans have expressed themselves through music, and until the 20th century, the lyrics and the instrumentation was very orderly and very biblical. And so you need to teach your children that music is theology, both externalized and internalized, because music is one of the most theologically influential arts there are. It expresses attitudes and emotions, attitudes towards truth, authority, and especially in the lyrics. But moving on very quickly, as we approach the 20th century, the cities are being finished, the cities with strong, free economies supported by vibrant farming towns. And what's going on then, and please make note of this, the 20th century, 300 years prior of good, solid Christian biblical nation building, and now in the 20th century, American culture begins to succumb to an antithetical urge in musical creativity, something different from nation building. It was fueled by, in a New York neighborhood known as Tin Pan Alley, they produced just thousands and thousands of songs every month, and we're putting them out there. And so many of America's hardworking nation builders now have children and grandchildren who had leisure time, some money to spend. They were buying the sheet music, they were playing it, and we started running into a period of great prosperity. There was freedom, there was wealth, there were advantages, there were cities, there were automobiles, there was mobility, roaring 20s prosperity. And these printing houses and record companies were using music to create a genuinely original, very different cultural structure. We experimented with the music of uninhibited immaturity. Jazz is an art form, but what if the music begins to dissipate into uninhibited sensuality, dragging the patrons along? And jazz started doing this 1905, 1910, 1915, 1920. Jazz and ragtime developed as a sloppy expression of mockery and criticism and covert protest against the triumphalism of the European traditions. And it wasn't just driven by black musicians, as some historians have suggested. It was rich white kids who were really in defiance of authority by misbehavior, and they were ragging the old days. They were ragging the founding fathers. That means it was they were in defiance of that authority and that triumphalism. The Broadway music publisher Edward Marks, who was publishing in New York, said the best songs come from the gutter. That's what they were looking for, and they were publishing these, and people were listening to them and singing them. It was discordant, unplanned collisions of harmony, and let me just summarize very quickly. This sloppy jazz was very infantile, and people were flocking to it. 1927, Cole Porter, a huge hit of the time. We're all alone, no chaperone can get our number. The world's in slumber. Let's misbehave. And this was a theme of the music in the early 1900s. There's something wild about you, child, that's so contagious. Let's be outrageous. Let's misbehave. They're advocating through the music a kind of moral dissipation that's rationalized misbehavior. And so in the 1930s, the explosion of radio and a way to deliver this kind of music to even more families. By 1937, out of 32 million American families, there were 27 million radio sets. And Hollywood was getting music out, and the moral tone of Hollywood and what was being communicated to make it acceptable in the culture. It was a dissipating culture, overpowering channels of new theology in music. I mean, and even Walt Disney was introducing new theologies to the country. When you wish upon a star, it makes no difference who you are. Anything your heart desires will come to you if you wish upon a star. If your heart is in your dream, no request is too extreme. When you wish upon a star, as dreamers do, it's a departure from the realities of the creation and the created order that God had given us, and people were playing around with this superstition theology. Victoria, you had some comments on what do you do in a home to change and go against the dominant culture of the day. Can you listen to music in the home?
Well, we listen to music at home almost all the time. One of the things we did to help the children learn to appreciate good instrumental music was to play music for the children and then talk about it. I tried to choose things that I knew the children would be able to appreciate. Colorful, dramatic pieces like the 1812 Overture, the William Tell Overture, Peter and the Wolf was a great favorite. The Nutcracker was a great favorite. They loved the orchestral parts of Carmen, Peer Gynt, Scheherazade, the Strauss waltzes. My children just loved this. My little girls, I can see it so clearly. They would waltz around the kitchen to the Strauss waltzes, and they would all gallop around the house to the William Tell Overture. Well, we were training their tastes and their appetites to appreciate what was good and what was beautiful and orderly. And when you do that, later on, your children won't be attracted to the bad and ugly, chaotic, discordant music, and in fact, they'll be repulsed by it. A great idea for those tired and too tired for normal school days, when you have smaller children, is to put on Peter and the Wolf, or The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra by Benjamin Britten, or Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, and talk to your children about what's happening in the music, and then maybe read aloud to them something about this composer's life, and then have them draw pictures of the things that you're reading about. You all have a great advantage today that we didn't have when my children were young. Today we can look at YouTube videos of great performers and great conductors and orchestras, and this is especially helpful if you can't afford to take your to go and see and hear a live orchestra. On the Western Conservatory website, we've tried to make up a list of some CDs that we would recommend, things that would be a good, inexpensive way to introduce your children to classical music, and maybe introduce yourselves to classical music. And I think we also have several books up there about different topics that we're talking about tonight that would be helpful to you.
Okay, Benjamin.
Okay, a couple comments about music education, performance, and careers, and we're going to have to. This is such a huge topic, and we've got so little time. I'm going to do great injustice to this subject in trying to abbreviate it. But it used to be that when people learned music or were taught music, it was understood that you were learning not only how to play it, but how music worked and how to compose it. In the mid-1800s, charismatic and virtuosic musicians like Paganini and Liszt took center stage, and we transitioned to the age of the virtuoso, where the focus on being able to understand and compose music became less important than your ability to perform it and having a good stage presence. Fast forward to today, and the majority of music teachers really only teach how to play music. And this has to change. We really should be looking for a more complete type of musical education that includes not just knowing how to play it, but how to create music and how to understand music and how to use music. Christians really need to be leading in the field of music and writing the songs that need to be written, writing the symphonies, developing the new instruments, discovering new things about music, and get to the point where the world comes to us to learn about music and not the other way around. And this is how it used to be. Probably the most influential and significant figure of the last millennium was a solid Christian craftsman and a father of 20 named Johann Sebastian Bach. Interestingly, even the more immoral and lawless composers of the last couple centuries have revered him as the godfather of music and scrupulously studied his music. So how do we get back there? Well, I'm afraid to go into detail, that's going to have to be a subject for another day. But when it comes to composition, I would recommend that we need to be bolder when it comes to composition, and it would probably be a great thing if a lot of the homeschool musicians out there were putting a little bit less of a focus on performance and all the recitals and all the competitions, and starting to turn their attention to learning to compose so we can be writing the music that's leading other people. Now, in regarding competitions and recitals, there can be good reasons to involve your children in the occasional recital or competition. It can be stretching. It can create opportunities to deal with nerves and fear of man issues. But it can be very easy to get carried away by the entire performance and competition world, especially if you're good. So I really recommend that parents and their children consider in advance their reasons and goals for involvement in music. Because if you don't, when the praise starts rolling in, it's real easy to get puffed up and lose sight of the bigger picture. So purposeless involvement in clubs, competitions, and recitals can consume one's life and boost one's pride. And I've seen many capable musician friends and acquaintances reach age 19 and then learn the hard way that they don't have any marketable skills, and that the pond they rose to the top of was actually a very small, isolated one. So Christians, let's reconsider our goals with music, with performance. And let's have a desire not only to play the music that already exists and to play the music of the world, but to be the vehicles through which the Christ-centered music of the future could be written. And I think that really needs to be our heart and really needs to be our goal. And don't be afraid. When it comes to composition, it's something you're kind of going to have to just jump into. You're not going to be very good when you start, and that's okay. A lot of people are very daunted by composition. They don't know much about it. They think it's a real sort of spiritual, nebulous, mystic kind of thing. But it's really like any other craft. It just takes hard work, a lot of perspiration, and a lot of study. Johann Sebastian Bach said this: "I was obliged to be industrious. Whoever is equally industrious will succeed equally well." So let's consider how industrious we're being and where we're focusing our industry.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Just a very quick note on learning an instrument. It can be helpful intellectually to your children to read music, but they could do that learning to sing. If the teacher who might be teaching your children an instrument are a bad influence on them, forget it. Don't even go there. Parents say, "Oh, but what about my gifted and talented? My child's really gifted and talented." The two greatest spiritual battles that you and your children will face between the ages of 10 and 20 are related to parental authority and how your children respond to that, and the emerging gifts. And this is one of the widest gateways to sin in our generation because of the gifts that they think they have. You know, if a little girl thinks she's totally, absolutely gifted in the ability to be a cheerleader, that it may not be a gift that qualifies her to conform to the ugly conventions of our time. It may not be a God-given gift. It may just be a lustful desire on her part to be seen and noticed as a performer. And so the ability to learn how to mimic fools and to show off foolishness is not a gift, it's a vice. Benjamin, if you want to add anything to this, it's such a phenomenal story what Ben's wife Audrey did with her life and her talent. She was a truly great, gifted cellist, but she made decisions, bigger decisions. I remember one quote. She said, I knew there was something more important for me to do than just to play the cello. And she, in marrying Ben, has discovered that. For the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, with all your heart and with all your soul. He brings tests like this, and there may be a genuine gift, but does that mean you have to chase it? Does that mean Daddy has to drop everything that he's invested in and done just to follow the child around? Of course not. Psalm 11, verse 4, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see and his eyelids test the children of men. And so some biblical truths about gifts, they come from God for a purpose, but the gift is not the purpose. Gifts are tests, gifts are tools. Gifts are a supernatural reality if it's a real gift. And the use of gifts is connected to service to God. And it may be, like with the Apostle Paul, he said, whatever things are gained to me, these things I've counted as lost for the sake of Christ. And knowing Christ, you may need to set one aside. And some of you parents have done that for the sake of your families. Prioritize every asset you've got for the King. And now we need to move into art very quickly. And I should just say, your children are so completely surrounded by really bad art. And the ugly art in our generation, like Picasso, like the art they see on billboards, the art they see surrounding them all over the place, on taxi cabs, on the sides of buses, it inspires men to rebellion. Selfish art inspires men to childishness. Undisciplined art destroys standards of discipline. Meaningless art robs men of hope and vision. And I just want to bring Elizabeth up here to say something she's learned about art. Art will be either Christian or anti-Christian. Elizabeth.
Well, good evening, everyone. I think one thing Mom and Dad did that was really, really wise and really helpful for us kids is that they understood whether any of us became artists or not, all our lives we would be, in a sense, building a culture of art all around us. In the music that we play, the clothes that we wear, the things that we hang on our walls, the things we design. And they wanted us to understand that fundamentally every piece of art, as Dad was just saying, is a theological message. And one thing they taught us here is that all art reflects, both in content and in style, an attitude towards God, an attitude towards reality, an attitude towards the principles of design and beauty and harmony that God encoded in creation, and an attitude toward hard work and discipline. And they knew that we kids had to be able to tell the difference. Sometimes people talk about taste being an arbitrary and subjective thing. You know, you like this, I like that, you just have different taste than I do. But that's only partly true when it comes to art. Psalm 119:66 says, "Teach me good judgment and knowledge, for I have believed thy commandments." And the root word here for judgment, as you can see here in the PowerPoint, properly means taste. That is, figuratively, perception, intelligence, advice, behavior, decree, discretion, judgment, etc. And interestingly, this is actually the same word used in Proverbs 11:22 when it's describing the beautiful woman who doesn't have discretion. Literally, doesn't have taste, perception, and judgment. And this is actually very similar to how Webster's 1828 dictionary defines taste: judgment, discernment, nice perception, or the power of perceiving and relishing excellence in human performances. The faculty of discerning beauty, order, congruity, proportion, symmetry, or whatever constitutes excellence, particularly in the fine arts and belles lettres. Taste is not wholly the gift of nature, nor wholly the effect of art. It depends much on culture. We say a good taste or a fine taste. Or definition 5, style, manner, with respect to what is pleasing, as a poem or music composed in good taste. And so what Mom and Dad taught us is there are many different kinds of good art that we could like, just as there are many different varieties of terrible art that we shouldn't like. And there's a lot of room for variation in preferences in the good art. But taste is simply the ability to discern between the good and the bad, starting with the ability to discern between a good attitude and a bad attitude, and a good worldview and a bad worldview. And also that applies to good craftsmanship and bad craftsmanship. This is Anna speaking, by the way. The way a painting is painted, or a sculpture is sculpted, or a tapestry is woven should reflect, as Elizabeth was just saying, the order and the perfection of the way that God set up the universe. And how those rules are followed or broken is a big part of what makes art good or bad. So now, in a minute, we're just going to take a look at two paintings that have the exact same subject matter, but were executed in very different ways, and we're going to see if we can tell the difference. So here's the first one. And a lot of us might say that this was a nice picture, or even a very sweet, very pretty picture, until we compared it to this one by John Singer Sargent. We can see the subject matter is exactly the same, two little girls with flowers wearing white dresses, but the execution is so much better. The little girls look real, their proportions are correct, their arms are the right length, the lighting is so good. There's different kinds of lighting going on in the picture, but it's all executed so well. And the general composition is really well planned. And if we look closer, we can see amazing craftsmanship in every little brush stroke. And just a couple of quick strokes is all that he needed to create the impression of a perfectly proportioned hand or a rose. So you see there's not a single extra brush stroke, there's no smudge, there's nothing muddying up the picture. So now we're going to look at them both side by side. And now that we've seen an example of what excellence looks like, the picture that we first saw is very clearly not it. We can see the girls' proportions and their skin tones are off, the colors are insipid, there's no clear light source, the flowers look fake. It does not accurately reflect God's creation. It does not look like the real world, which is why it is not in good taste. So this sort of analysis is really very simple. It doesn't require spending 4 years at art school to tell the difference between these two paintings. And some might say that it isn't a fair comparison, since John Singer Sargent is just so clearly a superior artist. But natural genius is not the only thing that makes the painting on the right a much better painting than the painting on the left. Mostly it's hard work, good planning, good understanding of the rules, and very careful application of those rules, which is exactly what Ben was talking about with music. The artist in the painting on the left could have done a better job if he had just been working harder. And I should probably point out real quick that, as Elizabeth said, you can have different tastes in art. It doesn't all have to look like John Singer Sargent. We could paint a painting of a mother and a daughter that looked like this one coming up, or we could paint one that looked like the next one. It's a different color scheme, or we could do a more impressionistic one like the one coming up here. And all of that would be fine. They all show different ways of handling the same subject matter, and they're all valid because they all fit within the same principles of good art. But we really shouldn't paint one that looks like the next one. And again, the problem with this one here is not that the artist was not gifted, it's that the artist was not trying. He could have done a much better job if he was thinking and planning, and if he was applying better principles of design. So anyway, teaching us to recognize excellence and mediocrity was probably one of the most important things that our parents did to teach us how to strive for excellence and work hard. And the lessons that we learned from analyzing art applied to everything else that we did: music, film, photography, everything. And the main lesson was this: there is a common problem behind every bad painting, behind every hideous piece of furniture, behind every badly designed car, behind every frumpy outfit. And that is that somebody wasn't thinking, somebody wasn't trying, somebody was being sloppy and careless and not paying attention to the rules. And being discerning about art does not have to require higher knowledge or any kind of special genius. After just looking a lot of different pictures of art with our brains turned on, we will be able to see the difference between the sloppy and the precise, the undisciplined and the disciplined. Mom and Dad taught us this by talking to us about everything that we looked at, as Elizabeth was saying, from billboards to movie posters to paintings to children's book illustrations, everything. And actually, one of my favorite things to do with Dad, and this is a very easy thing for parents to do with small children, is that we would just sit down together and look at a book of Norman Rockwell post covers together, and we would talk about everything: the art, the content. It was probably one of the most educational things that I ever did with my parents. And I think that Dad and I should now reenact what that looked like a little bit. So I would turn to a picture like this and I would say, "So Daddy, what's going on in this picture?"
Wow. Okay. You know, and this is one of my most cherished memories too. Is just sitting with my daughter Anna, and she would ask me all kinds of questions, and she'd point to things, and I would be teaching her how to notice things, how to about just the craftsmanship of the art, but also the culture. And so on this one, I'd say, "Okay, what's happening?" And I'd get her to tell me. So Anna, what do you see here? What's going on in this setting? Where are they?
Well, it looks like they're in an old diner or something like that.
Yeah, but it wasn't an old diner then. That's how all diners looked at that point, back here in the 1940s. And so on the right, what's the old lady doing?
It looks like she's praying.
Okay. What's happening?
It looks like everybody in the diner has stopped what they're doing to watch what's going on.
Okay, they have, and they're stopped in a reverent freeze because they're seeing something that's disappearing in America. The reverence that is shown by those who will stop and thank God for their food. These guys, from the workers, the tradesmen who are here, the union members who are sitting on the left-hand side of the table, to the businessman in the foreground, the man who's about to leave, everybody stops and looks and remembers this is what America was and what it was like.
Okay, well, let's look at another one, Daddy.
Okay, so Anna, sweetie, what this little girl is, she's turned around in her seat on a what? What is she riding on?
I think it's a train.
Yes, it's a train. Have you ever been on a train?
I don't think so.
No, so she has. So she needs to know about this. This is wartime, 1940s. Everybody traveled on trains back then. This was the common way to get across country or even across state. There were buses. There was some plane travel, but plane travel was very restricted. And she's looking around. She probably at first began by just putting her eyes over, and now her whole head is over the back of the chair, up to her chin. What is she looking at, Anna?
I think it looks like a couple of people who are acting immorally.
Okay, so Anna she'd say, "Well, Dad, I don't know. Tell me." And I'd say, "Okay, well, you can see from their feet. There's a male and there's a female, and they're really close. They're kind of entwined, and they're being very intimate with one another, whispering to one another." And this little girl obviously has never seen it, and she's captivated by it because she wants to know, is this what life is like when you grow up? Is this what happens? Should this be? And I'd say, Anna, do you think they should be that intimate there in this public place like this? And Anna would try to form an opinion on it, right?
Okay. I don't know. Are they married?
Yeah. And she'd ask me that. Well, who are they? What is this guy? I mean, he's a soldier. He has a uniform on. And then in the very foreground, you see, well, hey, there's a sailor with a red head, and her face is right up next to his face, too. What's going on here? Well, and so then we would talk about the cultural conventions of our time with dating and what happens and what Daddy thinks about that. Moving on, Anna.
Okay, so Daddy, do you think that Da Vinci was better or Bouguereau?
Okay. This Bouguereau on the right is actually a superior craftsman than Da Vinci. And he had studied human anatomy so well. He had studied actually dermatology. He'd studied skin. He'd studied textiles. He had studied pigments. And he was such a phenomenal painter. He was able to show things with human skin that no other painter had ever been able to do to his time. And we would talk about this. And what you see, and we'd talk about the accomplishments of Leonardo da Vinci. People say he's a genius. Well, he simply just applied himself really well. He thought about things. And we would talk about how these different men came to be great at what they did, accomplished at what they did, and how did they use their knowledge? In what direction did they use it? Actually, Da Vinci used his in a more responsible way than Bouguereau used his very superior talent.
Can we look at some little children's book illustrations here? What do you think of this one?
Now, this is from one of my very favorite, and I mean, I would classify this book, The Oxcart Man, as one of my very favorite nation-building books. It's about the industrious relationship of one family and how they all work together to build up a family economy and prosper together. And so the daddy's in the field with the little girl. It's springtime. You can see the clues that are given in very simple art. It's very valid art. It's very edifying art. It's very instructive art. It's very accurate art, even biologically with the specimens that they put in there. And it's a picture book, and so is a picture of an entire year of how the family worked together to raise the food that they needed to eat, and then create enough product that they could trade with in the community to build up the local free market economy.
Okay, so what do you think about this one?
Okay. This is the kind of book that we'd probably, if we had in our house, we'd probably cover up the cover with some brown paper or something, because we just didn't want our children to be exposed to such substandard imagery as this, especially in the name of Christ. It's embarrassing to me to see it. Publishers who put this kind of thing out are not helping. I can understand the pressures of publishing and how men do it. But I'm very concerned about the shoddy reputation that Christians are getting for what they do in their literature, their writing, and the execution of the disciplines of culture and the arts. Oh, here's another one, Anna, that we probably would not have this kind of cutesy stuff in the home, or if we did, we would explain very, very carefully, or as carefully as we could. Why is there a tendency and a leaning to move toward infantilism? Even the adults are depicted here as little tiny cute children that aren't even anatomical. What's going on here? Why do we have such a desire for symbolic infantilism in what we're doing, even associated with a very important story from Scripture? And so, Anna, when you would have seen that as a little girl, what would you have thought about that if we had let you see it?
I think I probably would have been disgusted by the fact that it looked like little children were representing adults. Mm-hmm. And I think I probably would have felt insulted by the way they were drawn and how anatomically incorrect they were.
Okay, well, what would you have thought about this one? It has a nice little girl pink in it. Would that have appealed to you as a little girl?
It probably would have if I hadn't been raised on Rembrandt. But
okay. All right. Right. So this is the kind of thing that can so confuse our children with materialistic ideas and ideas of things that are being glorified with art. With somebody's taken time to do this, but what is the purpose? What is the meaning of it? Are they glorifying the urban life, the nightlife? I mean, here we are. It's night, and we have all these little accoutrements of what? Royalty and ease and luxury and soft little animals. What is this communicating? There's theology here. What is it saying? What does it mean? Take a look at this one, and you parents need to be aware of these kinds of things coming into your homes. Can you explain and interpret what's going on in a picture like this? This is a huge phenomenon. You have look at the anatomical monstrous exaggeration of anatomy here, and it's consistent. I mean, if they can draw 10,000 young people to look like this, with the eyes the very same and the mouth and the nose the very same, it's not an accident that they've done this. They're doing it to pursue a style. They're doing it to copy a style that's popular, to satisfy the appetite of people who want to buy this kind of thing and indulge in this kind of meaningless, disjointed art form. Anna, how would this have struck you as a young lady?
I think I probably would have just found it very confusing and wouldn't have really known what to think of it.
The culture that this has created in Japan and is continuing to build in the United States, the guy on the right is called a herbivore now in Japan. He represents a style of millennial, a young 20-something kid who just is involved in fantasy art, fantasy games, fantasy pornography his whole life. He can't even have a relationship with a real flesh and blood human being. That's why they call him a herbivore. That's a scientific term for someone who can't handle meat or flesh. All they do is they eat plants. They survive on that kind of diet, and this is what we're producing in this kind of infantile art. Exaggerated forms of fantasy. You need to talk to your children about the theology behind the superhero and why that has become so popular, and you need to talk also about the exaggerated forms of art, which may be graphically well executed, even in terms of anatomy. Now, the anatomy is off here and on the left thigh of the model here. Okay, that's not how the muscles of the human body work. But you can note these things for your children, but talk to them about the theology in there. We'll talk about film a little bit later on. Again, Pablo Picasso, with his depraved mind, he was given over to a depraved mind because of his rejection of God. He didn't acknowledge God any longer. He suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. Romans 1 tells us that you'll get a deranged mind. A deranged, unpure mind will give this kind and produce this kind of art. Anna, your comments on this one, please.
Yeah, well, you taught me something very important about this type of art, and that is that the art world and the music world are both infected with the idea that the highest artistic expression is one that just comes from inside us, from our hearts, from our emotional impulses. They think it's better if it's more spontaneous and less planned and worked out. And one thing that I know really frustrated you, Dad, was that Christian artists have taken this to a worse extreme by thinking that those emotional impulses are from the Holy Spirit, which makes their art inspired and above rules and above criticism. And I believe this is why there is so much poor art and music and filmmaking coming out of the Christian community. And I believe that we take the Lord's name in vain when we say that He or His Holy Spirit is responsible for our sloppy, mediocre efforts, like this one in this picture here. Right. And one thing that you taught us, probably the most important thing that you taught us, is that God is glorified through our hard work, our attention to His principles of order and beauty, and our humility before Him as the real Creator. But anyway, moving along here, besides analyzing art for us, the other way that they directed our taste was with the home environment that they created. They were very deliberate about the music that shaped the atmosphere, the pictures that were hanging on the wall, the books, the toys, the films that we had in our home. I'm going to read a quote by Anna Pavlova, the famous ballerina, as she described her training at the Russian Imperial School. She says, "From the very hour of my 9th year that my mother gave me into the keeping of the Imperial School, to the time I began my world wanderings, I never saw a badly painted, cheap or stupid picture. I never read an ill-written, tawdry or trashy book. I never saw acting that was not the finest. I never attended an ill-made play or badly sung opera. I never ate a badly cooked or ill-chosen meal." As you can see, that by exposing the students to excellence, only to excellence, they protected them from the knowledge that anything less existed. And even though this example is a little bit extreme, there's a principle being communicated here, which is this: you become what you look like, what you look at. You learn to speak like the people around you. You learn to write books like the ones that you read. And you learn to compose music and create art like what you've grown up seeing. And I just want to thank my parents right now for realizing this and being very, very careful about the way that they trained us.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's Elizabeth again, just wanting to add something to the end of that. Mom and Dad knew that whether we became artists or not, all of our lives we'd be building a culture of art around us. We'd eventually be creating art everywhere we went, which is actually exactly what's happened, even all of us who are the least artistically inclined. And so they wanted to be really, really careful that they were guiding us toward more disciplined efforts and better taste in all of our creative endeavors, from the little people we made out of Play-Doh to the pictures we drew. And so if we did something in a sloppy way or with a bad attitude, they wouldn't say, "Oh, great job, you are so talented." Or if we seemed attracted to things that were ugly, like some of the pictures that Dad and Anna were showing you a minute ago, or things that were smarmy or chaotic or had a bad view of reality, they wouldn't say, "Oh, you're just so unique, such a free spirit." They would keep trying to disciple our attitude back toward God, give us a good attitude toward God's created order, a good attitude towards reality, a good understanding of reality, and the colors that reality is, and also a good attitude towards hard work and discipline. And that actually leads me to the subject of fashion. We're including fashion in here because there's a rising number of young women who would like to give the world an alternative to the fashions of Madison Avenue, whether that be in fashion blogging or creating actual lines of clothing. And this is yet another area that needs to be reclaimed. But like art and film and music, it's an extremely dangerous arena with a lot of opportunity to make provision for the flesh. Last year, my sister and I actually produced a webinar called Reclaiming Beauty, a New Look at How to Glorify God in Your Body. And in this webinar, we actually talked a little bit about how to study this whole subject in a lot more detail, and you can find that on our family's website, westernconservatory.com. But for tonight, I'll just share a couple thoughts really quickly for any young ladies out there who are interested in studying fashion. Fashion really needs to be approached in the same way as art and music. It's hard work and study that will win the day, not emotional impulse, not self-expression. If we want to have an impact and make a difference, we have to be theologians and craftsmen instead of clothes horses and shoe junkies. And we have to have a very, very big and strong vision for creating something better than the world, instead of a little vision of taking what the world does and making it a little bit more modest. And we have to be willing to make enemies with the world instead of making friends. Interestingly, it's the girls who are interested in fashion reformation more than any other girls who are going to have to crucify their flesh in this area and put to death any vanity, shallowness, obsession with accumulating shoes and lipstick, infatuation with fashion trends, mania for looking cute, a love of taking pictures of themselves wearing cute clothes. Or else, if they don't do this, instead of taking possession in this area, fashion is going to take possession of them.
Okay, my son Isaac. Isaac's coming to us from another time zone tonight. Isaac, please help us with some of your observations on photography. How valid is that and useful to young homeschooled graduates?
Well, photography, if you hadn't guessed already, we're going to have basically the same attitude towards photography as fashion or art or music. And a lot of people get into photography as an art form because it seems on the surface easier than painting, and you certainly don't have to master the same aspects of mixing colors and being able to draw. But the same arguments about subjectivity and objectivity are going to need to be made. And the other thing about photography, at the moment, photography is a very easy hobby to get into because cameras are so cheap. Pretty much every phone has a camera on it now. And so photography is an easy way to very selfishly pursue self-expression. And I don't really want to spend a lot of time on photography since so many of the points are the same as the points that have just been made about fine art. But this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit about the concept of hobbies and the idea that Christians really shouldn't have hobbies. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't do work for free, but the idea of having a hobby that you do purely for self-gratification or for self-expression is not something that a Christian should be doing. Christians should be learning skills and desiring to express their Creator. So if you are a photographer, you have a duty to be disciplined and careful and to become a good craftsman and have a distinct purpose for your work. And if your goal in photography is just to get attention on Instagram, then you need to get real and do something more productive. And the same issues are going to be across all of these different disciplines of art and music and culture. To do something well is going to be very expensive time-wise. It's going to require a very large investment of time. And to do things poorly is really not an option. So we need to be very deliberate in getting into these things.
Okay, Isaac, stick with me as we dive into filmmaking. And families, you need to be so careful about bringing any of these kinds of forms of media into your home, especially the music, but also filmmaking and animation. You need to know how to analyze film. And the reason that we would actually bring some films into our home, and actually I would preview them This is typically what we do when the children were really small. I would preview a film occasionally and look for lessons that might be valuable to my children, because American film is such a succinct summary of the culture of our time. The modern dramas, for example. If we want to interpret our world and culture to our children without dragging them down to Grand Central Station or taking them to a ball game or something, and just so that they're just surrounded by it, it's so easy to do it with a film. So you can stop the film, talk about what they're seeing, and say, let me analyze this for you. Do you have any questions about this? Why is he talking to her that way? Why is she talking to him that way? Stop, and we look at it and take in a little bit more of the story. This is how we have used film, watched film. Here's a quote I want to share with you, written by Ben Hecht, who was in Hollywood back in the 20s and the 30s and saw what was coming and what was happening. He was one of the highest paid professionals in Hollywood for his advice on story and scripting. He said, cultured people who would have blushed with shame to be found with a dime novel in their hands took to flocking shamelessly to watch the picturization of such tripe on the screen. And this is what happened when it became accessible, even to Christians in churches, to be acceptable in the culture. They were taking vaudevillian, gutter language and songs and putting them up on the screen and saying, this is high art, this is cinema. We should go see this because we need to know about it. This was a change in the culture of America that was very destructive to the American family and to the entire culture. He goes on to say, for 40 years, the movies have drummed away on the American character. They have fed it naivete and bunkum in doses never before administered to any people. They have slapped into the American mind more human misinformation in one evening than the Dark Ages could muster in a decade. Movies, he goes on to say, are one of the bad habits that have corrupted our century. And let me just say this, parents, just because you may know the Botkin family as being interested in film professionally, we would agree with Ben Hecht that movies are one of the bad habits that have corrupted our century. So is popular music. So is country western music. Country western music has the same elements of rationalized misbehavior. It's the same elements of sexual deviant activity as normal. Ben goes on to say that the movies are an eruption of trash that has lamed the American mind and retarded Americans from becoming cultured people. And movies, to the extent that your family digest these on a regular basis, you cannot have a Christian mind, you cannot have a pure mind, you cannot have a holy mind, you cannot have an orderly mind, because it will be given over if you cease to acknowledge God, compromise in this area of purity. You will have a deranged mind, courtesy of the chastisement of a God who loves you. A Hollywood movie, people ask me, what's a Hollywood movie? It's a film created to imitate or impress Hollywood culture by perpetuating Hollywood culture. And do any of you children have anything to say or add about how what you remember about the ways that your parents used film to instruct you about culture and teach you about it?
Well, we didn't watch a lot of movies when we were young, or now, actually, but when we did, it was always super, super educational. Because Mom and Dad knew that even when we were toddlers, we weren't just little passive minds that were being mindlessly entertained by the moving things on the screen. We were very active, curious, searching little minds. We were little sponges that were soaking up everything that we were seeing, looking for any information we could find about how the big world works. So, we'd be sitting there, little 2- and 3-year-olds, thinking, oh, that's how cool kids talk to their parents, or, oh, so that's what it's like to fall in love. And Mom and Dad knew that if we were not, even as 2- and 3-year-olds, learning the right perspective from them, we would be very busy learning the wrong perspective from somewhere else. So they would use movies as a platform to teach us about the big world out there and the people in it from the safety of our own home. And they would tell us what is funny, what isn't funny, what's good character, what's bad character, what's good theology, what's bad theology. And we would even talk about, well, what would we do if we were in a situation like that? And I can still remember some really specific things Dad told me when I was probably 2 years old, just assuming that I'd be able to understand it, which I did, I think. Things like, can you see how that girl has her claws out for that boy? Or, that daughter there is being dishonoring and rebellious. Do you know what the Lord says about that? Or Jiminy Cricket is being a bad conscience. Do you know what a conscience is? And so by doing this, Mom and Dad were giving us, 1, a framework for interpreting the world around us, but 2, a framework for interpreting the messages that the film industry would be trying to send.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Isaac, if you're still on and with us, would you like to give just 45 seconds on web design, graphic design? We would like to hear from you on that.
Yes. Well, this is an aspect of art and culture that gets ignored because it's not as cool as painting or photography or making music or being a filmmaker. But the internet is definitely a growth industry, and web design and graphic design are things that you can do from home and learn for free. No one asks to see your degree when you're making them a website for the most part. And the tools that you use are very inexpensive. So these are things that Christian entrepreneurs should definitely be aware of. And this is something that we're going to talk a little bit more about in the next session. We're going to be talking about math and science, and we're putting computer programming and web development into the math portion of that. But this is something that we need to be sure that we're not looking down our noses at in the pursuit of something that is just defined as being more cool by the world. And one of the things that Anna and Elizabeth have talked about earlier, and I know that, Dad, you have comments on, is this idea that there are right-brained and left-brained people that have different skills, but that also have different values. So maybe that would be a good thing to talk about right now.
Well, I would love to dig into that a lot, but we're really out of time today. I so thank you all for your patience. There's just so much we want to tell you and talk about, and we tend to go long with you. Thank you for being part of our home and part of our learning experience. What Isaac's referring to is that there are things that are communicated in the culture that give people excuses to say, well, I'm not really a morning person, so therefore I don't have to get up and be productive. And so if they want to say, oh, well, I'm more of a left brain person, and so I'm artsy and emotional and spiritual and inspired and creative, and so I don't really have to be disciplined like Isaac Botkin, because I'm different. And so, okay, so it's left, right, it's being so confused in our culture, but you know what I mean. There are trends, there are pop pseudo-psychology, primarily excuses to say, and let me just say about pseudo-psychology, it has been developed as a way to excuse the principle of biblical sin, so that people can find excuses for how they live. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is our culture that your children are growing into. They need to be able to understand the toxins and the poisons. Culture is any and all human effort and labor expended upon the cosmos, anywhere, under the earth, on the earth, to unearth its treasures and its riches and to bring them into the service of man for the enrichment of human existence unto the glory of God. That's what culture is. And so I want to thank you for joining us for this. Next week we'll be talking about taking dominion of the earth, studying science, math, engineering, medicine, computer science, agriculture, construction, the basic knowledge necessary in order to participate actively in 21st century progress. Okay, we've got one question that apparently is so important that I've been handed it by airmail here. What is the difference, Mr. Botkin, between classical Christian and biblical Hebrew education, and which do you recommend? Well, what's termed in many circles in the United States as classical Christian is a mixture of pagan Greco-Roman education with some aspects of Christian, but it's very, very dangerous. Biblical Hebrew education simply is parents walking very closely with their children to teach them carefully the law of God. Well, of course, I would prefer the latter, which is a home-based education based on understanding the wisdom of God and applying the wisdom of God and the Word of God in everyday life, every circumstance, whereas the classical Christian can devolve into almost an idolatrous attitude toward the so-called smart guys back in the age of Greece and Rome, in a classroom setting where slaves were educated by their rulers. We don't like that kind of education. Did my children learn a little bit of Latin? Yes, they did, but we did not pursue a classical Christian model. Does Mr. Botkin know some Greek? Yes, I've studied a lot of Greek, but that doesn't make me a proponent of classical Christian education. I would steer you to the Deuteronomy 6 model. If you missed the first section, just get out Deuteronomy 6 and read it and rejoice in it, and may God give you grace to follow what you have. And on that note, we'll say farewell tonight until next time. God bless you.